I have some requests for you, first of all. Number one is, if you take a photo of me, please do not put it in Facebook or Instagram or WhatsApp. Because that company is a monstrous surveillance engine. It uses face recognition to track people. So if you put the photo of someone in Facebook, you give Facebook one more opportunity to track that person. It's bad treatment of somebody to put that person's photo in Facebook. Please don't do it to your friends, and please don't do it to me. Second, if you make a recording of this talk and you want to distribute copies, please do so solely in the formats that are favorable to free software. That means the OGG formats and the WebM format. Please do not use MP anything, because those are patented in many countries. Especially do not use Flash, because that requires proprietary software, which you shouldn't have in your machine. And don't use Windows Media Player, Real Player, or QuickTime. QuickTime is bad because it's especially bad because it's associated with iTunes. iTunes is vicious because it requires Apple's non-free software to download anything. So nothing should ever be distributed through iTunes. Second, please make sure that normal use of the distribution site permits downloading a copy of the recording without running any non-free software, including non-free JavaScript software in the web page itself. This is why YouTube is not good. YouTube distributes WebM format, which is a good format, but in order to watch it, one has to run the non-free JavaScript software sent by YouTube. And please put on the recording the Creative Commons No Derivatives license, because this is a presentation of a point of view. It's starting to get hot in here. Is there any chance of increasing the air conditioning? If it's not already at maximum, please try to do that. So, this talk is about a free digital society. You will come across many projects that say their goal is digital inclusion or closing the digital divide. Those concepts take for granted that participation in a digital society is good. But that's not necessarily so. Whether being in the digital society is good or bad depends on whether that digital society is just or unjust. If we have an unjust digital society, then the proper goal is not digital inclusion, but digital extraction, extracting us from it so we don't have to be oppressed by it anymore. So what makes the digital society just or unjust? There are many different issues that affect the freedom of the users of digital technology, and I'm going to go through lots of them today, starting with the issue of free versus non-free software. First of all, free software is a matter of freedom, not price. It's frei, not kostenlos. Ethically speaking, it doesn't matter very much whether you pay to get a copy or get one gratis. The important question is, once you've got a copy, does it respect your freedom or not? See, that's what makes the copy a good thing or a bad thing. If it's freedom respecting, fine if you pay somebody for the copy. And if it's not freedom respecting, then it's bad. even if you got it gratis, it still hurts you. So this is about freedom. But what is a program anyway? And what's a computer? Well, a computer is a universal computing device, which conceptually is very simple. All it does is get the next instruction and execute that instruction, and then repeat. Get the next instruction and execute it. Get the next and execute it over and over. And it gets these instructions out of a program. So by which instructions are in the program, that tells the computer which computation to do. And with the right program, you can make the computer do anything. Well, almost anything. There are some limitations. So who gives the instructions to your computer? You might think it's you, when really it's someone else. You might think the computer is obeying you, when really it obeys somebody else first, in first place, and obeys you only as much as the somebody else tells it to obey you. With any program, there are two possibilities. Either the users control the program, or the program controls the users. There's no other possible way. When the users control the program, we call that free software. Freedom is having control of your own life. If you use a program to do the activities in your life, freedom requires that you control that program, so that you control the activity it does for you. But in order for you to control the program, you need the 4 essential freedoms. These are the definition, concretely, of free software, the criteria. Freedom 0 is the freedom to run the program as you wish for any purpose. Freedom 1 is the freedom to change the program so that it does your computing activities the way you wish. Would you like to get me some more tea? In order practically to have the freedom to change the program, you've got to have the source code. Here you see some source code. It's written in sort of algebra, and if you learn to program, you can understand what the source code means, and you can change it. In order to run the program, we typically convert it into an executable, which is a bunch of 1s and 0s that even a programmer can't understand. It's very hard to understand what they mean. Thanks. So if all you get is an executable, then you may nominally be free to change the program, but in practice, you don't have the option. So part of freedom 1 is that the users get the source code. Freedom 0 and 1 give us separate control over the program. So you can change your copies, and I can change my copies. But I can't change yours, and you can't change mine. That wouldn't be right. Here we see 4 users. One of them is exercising freedom 1 and changing the program, and the other 3, presumably they have the freedom, but they choose not to do it. So this is fine, but it's not enough, because most users are not programmers, and they don't understand what source code means. So in practice, they don't really effectively have control over the program just because they have source code that they're free to read and change. And even for a programmer, separate control is not enough. You probably use thousands of programs. That's too much for one person to study and master. And how could you write by yourself all the changes you might want in those programs? Separate control is not enough. We need collective control too, which means the freedom to work with others exercising control over what that program does. Here we see a group of 3 users. that are working together to adapt the program to their wishes. 2 of them are actually changing the program. I guess they're programmers. The third one is not actually changing the program, but is talking with them about what to do. This is how non-programmers participate in control over the program. So, of course, you don't have to participate in a group. You don't have to work with other users this way. At the bottom, there are 2 other users that are not doing so. If it's free software, they're free to do so, but nothing requires them to. It's not obligatory. This collective control requires 2 more essential freedoms. Freedom 2 is the freedom to make exact copies of the program, to give or sell them to others when you wish. And freedom 3 is to make copies of your modified versions and give or sell them to others when you wish. With these 2 freedoms, the members of the group can exchange their versions, and thus they can work together as each one makes contributions to the change that they're doing. And they're also free to offer their modified versions to others, even offer them to the public. Freedom 2 includes something that's ethically essential. That's a crucial moral issue, and that is the freedom to share. Sharing a published work means non-commercial redistribution of exact copies of the work. So that's actually, the freedom to share is just a part of Freedom 2. Freedom 2 includes commercial redistribution as well, but the non-commercial part is especially important because forbidding people to share is a form of divide and rule. It's digital colonization. Forbidding people to share copies of a published work is an attack on social solidarity, an attempt to keep everybody divided so that they're weak and easily mistreated. So you should never accept anyone stopping you from sharing. If someone asks you to agree in exchange for getting a copy to promise you won't share it, you should say no. But what if you already agreed and now your good friend is asking you for a copy? That puts you in a moral dilemma where you have to choose between 2 evils. You can either give your friend a copy and violate the license, or you can refuse your friend a copy and comply with the license. In each case, you're doing wrong. So what should you do? You should do the lesser evil, which is to give your good friend a copy and violate the license. And the reason is, your good friend presumably deserves your cooperation, and whoever made you sign that license deliberately attacked your community and doesn't deserve anything good. So if you've got to do wrong to one or the other, don't do it to your friend. Do it to this malicious distributor. But being the lesser evil does not make it good. An unauthorized copy of a proprietary program is a rather nasty thing. It's almost as bad as an authorized copy. It's bad because it's proprietary. Making unauthorized copies doesn't get you the source code. It doesn't give people the freedom to openly work together on changing that program. So it still subjugates people. Therefore, unauthorized copies of proprietary software are not the solution to the problem to the injustice of proprietary software. They're a part of the problem. The solution is reject proprietary software. And that's what the free software movement is for. So if the users have these 4 freedoms adequately, then the users control the program is free, and that's how things should be. But if one of these freedoms is missing or insufficient, then the users do not control the program, so the program controls the users, and the owner or developer controls the program. So this is an injustice. A proprietary program is an injustice. They should not exist. It should be noted that the difference between free software and proprietary software is purely a matter of how the program is made available to users. It's not a question of what's in the program. It's not a question of what features it has, or how they work, or how the code was written. Those are technical details. They don't affect whether the program is free or not. Any program can be distributed as free software. Any program can be distributed as proprietary software, and sometimes the same code is distributed in both ways in parallel. Once they have this power over the users, what do they do with it? They use the power to mistreat the users. For instance, they spy on users. This is a real feature in iThings. They have transmitters that are designed so that receivers can follow them, can tell where they are. And some stores put these receivers around the store so they could track people around. Another example of spying is in the Amazon swindle. Amazon's nasty ebook reader. It sends messages to Amazon saying what book is being read and what page. They go beyond spying. They also intentionally restrict users. They design software to stop users from doing things that users wish to do. And I'm not talking about the failure to implement some nice feature. I'm talking about working intentionally to make it hard to do things. We call this DRM, Digital Restrictions Management, or Technical Restriction Measures, or digital handcuffs. This is the monstrous blue ray that attacks the user who wishes to make a copy. Of course, it's sort of a metaphor. The disk doesn't actually shoot a ray at the user, but it's designed to stop users from copying, and no one knows how to overcome that malicious design. DRM is found in many digital products and programs, but it gets even worse. There's sabotage. The Amazon swindle has a backdoor for remotely deleting books. We found out about this in 2009. Amazon committed the Orwellian act of deleting thousands of copies of a particular book. Somebody came to my talk and told me that he was reading the book when it disappeared on him. And what was the book? It was 1984 by George Orwell. Amazon, facing lots of criticism, promised it would never do this again unless ordered to by the state. If you've read 1984, you will not consider that promise very good, but don't worry, Amazon doesn't keep it anyway. It was not a real promise. It was not meant to be kept. It was just a way of taking the inertia, the momentum out of the criticism. And sometimes they impose censorship, like Apple. Apple started this with the iThings. They are designed to censor the installation of apps. The users can't freely install whatever apps they wish. They can only install the apps chosen by Apple from its crap store. And when they found ways to bypass the censorship, They called it jailbreaking, effectively saying that these products are jails. So that's our term for a product designed to censor what programs a user can install. They're jails. There are other kinds of sabotage. In the PlayStation 3, there were initially two modes of use: to play games using the game network or to install another operating system such as gnu+linux. And then somebody found a way to break some DRM from gnu+linux, so Sony decided to basically wreck the machines remotely. Sony made a firmware downgrade and said, if you don't install the downgrade, you won't be able to talk to the games network anymore. But the downgrade removed the ability to run another operating system. So if you did install the downgrade, you couldn't run gnu+linux on it anymore. Thus, each user was forced to choose one kind of sabotage or another kind of sabotage. And I guess Sony's idea is this is okay because the users had a choice. Imagine a thief who says, I gave him a choice. I said, your money or your life. That makes it okay, right? No. But there's more sabotage. Some systems have universal backdoors where somebody can forcibly change the software. There's a universal backdoor in Windows since Windows XP. That's when somebody detected it. It was not announced. Microsoft didn't say, by the way, we can change your software by force at any time over the net, but someone figured out that that was true. But in fact, you can see how the ethical standards of the industry continue to sync. With Windows 10, it's no longer hidden. Microsoft admits that it forces all upgrades and downgrades. The users will no longer be even supposedly be able to refuse a downgrade. Universal backdoors are also found in other products, such as the Amazon swindle and nearly all portable phones. The universal backdoor in phones has been employed to convert them into listening devices, which listen all the time and transmit whatever they hear. Even if you're not talking straight into the microphone, it can listen to you from over there. And if you think you can get your privacy back by switching it off, ha. It pretends to switch off, but it keeps running and listening and transmitting all the time. The only way to stop it is to remove all the batteries. Not just the big, obvious battery. You have to remove all the batteries, some of which can't be removed, maybe, depending on the model. So a portable phone, since it's transmitting, the system always knows where you are, and it can listen to you. So I consider it Stalin's dream. If Stalin could have given everyone in the Soviet Union something that would track that person everywhere and listen to that person when desired, he would have been delighted, but it didn't exist yet. Nowadays, that's what they are getting people to carry, but not me. Because by my ethical standards about surveillance, that's absolutely outrageous and intolerable, and I will not carry such a thing, no matter how useful it might appear to be. Some things we must not accept. Android has something like a universal backdoor. Android has free components and proprietary components. And one of the proprietary components, Google Play, has a backdoor that can forcibly install or deinstall applications, which is almost equivalent to a universal backdoor. There are other kinds of sabotage too. Microsoft sabotages Windows users by showing bugs in Windows to the NSA before it fixes them. And this is something any proprietary software developer might be doing, and we have no way of knowing who else does it. And if they're not showing it to the NSA, maybe they're showing it to the Chinese government or the British government or the German government or who knows. Or all of them at once. This has implications for national security. Do you think your government should use Windows? Basically, I should mention also Flash Player is malware. It has a tracking feature and digital handcuffs. It's an interesting example because it's gratis, but it's not free. This is an informative example because it shows us why being gratis doesn't matter. The fact that Flash Player is gratis means that Adobe does not make users pay to be abused. They can be abused at no charge. Well, these examples are just a few, but they're so widely used, you can now see that most users of proprietary software are the victims of proprietary malware. That's what it means to be using proprietary software. I can't claim that every proprietary program is malware. I don't know. We can't check, right? Without the source code, there's no way to check. But unless you can recompile it yourself and run the version you compiled and join with others to maintain it and so on, just getting the source code doesn't prove anything either. Now, why do they do this? It's not that they're sadists. It's that they found ways to profit by mistreating their own users. The result is, to use a proprietary program to trust a proprietary program is an act of blind faith. There is no possible rational basis to trust it. You're giving blind faith to a company which, if it isn't new, has probably proved already that it doesn't deserve your trust. There are two possibilities with every proprietary program. Either we know of malicious functions, or we don't know whether there are any. It's impossible to make sure there are none. That possibility doesn't exist for proprietary software. So proprietary software does computing for suckers. If you don't want to be a sucker, don't use it. The only way to have a rational basis to trust a program is if it's free software. Now, why do we have a rational basis to trust free software? Because the users have a defense. The users control the program. The users can see if there's anything nasty in it, and if they find something nasty, they can remove it. See, I've told you examples of proprietary programs where we know that they're malware. For a lot more examples, look at gnu.org/proprietary. But even when we know the users can't do anything about it, they're helpless. Whereas in the free world, the users are not helpless. The users have a defense, and it's the only known defense against malware. It's not a perfect defense. There are unusual cases of free programs that are known to be malware. But people can make modified versions that are not malware. So we have a defense, which is a lot better than being defenseless. The ethical standards in proprietary software has disappeared. They have no shame about what they're doing. They give speeches where they describe their latest clever methods of taking advantage of their own users and clients. If you don't want to be a sucker, escape and join us in the free world. Here's the free world. It's built by the gnu/linux system, the GNU operating system with Linux as the kernel. I started developing GNU in January 1984. I wanted to make it possible to use a computer in freedom. That was impossible because the computer needs an operating system to do anything, and all the operating systems were proprietary. So the only way to have a free one was to write one, so I was elected. By 1992, we had most of the GNU system, but one essential component was missing. That was the kernel. The kernel is the component that allocates the machine's resources to the other programs. In that year, Mr. Torvalds, who had written a proprietary kernel in 1991 called Linux, in 1992, he liberated it. He released the source code under the GNU General Public License, which was one of several free software licenses in use at the time. The free software license is what gives the users the four freedoms. Under today's copyright law, due to a very bad mistake called the Berne Convention, everything that's written is automatically copyrighted. The only way for a program to be free software is if it explicitly carries a license placed on it by the copyright holders, giving the users the four freedoms. That's what makes it free software. So that any license that gives users the four freedoms in an adequate way is a free software license. The GNU General Public License is the one that I wrote, and that most free programs still use. So by once Linux was free, fitting Linux into the gap in the GNU system produced a complete free operating system, basically GNU, but also with Linux. That system is basically free, but in practice it isn't, because there are many variants of the system. They're called distributions or distros, and most of them contain some non-free additives which basically ruin the freedom of the whole thing. So there are over 1,000 distros, and most of them contain proprietary programs, so they're not free as a whole. Now, what does this mean? An operating system is a collection nowadays typically of thousands of programs. In order for that collection to respect the user's freedom, every piece in the collection must respect the user's freedom. If there's one piece that takes away the user's freedom, the system as a whole takes it away. And so most of these distributions are not free. They mostly consist of free software, but they contain other non-free programs that ethically spoil them. But there are a few distros that are entirely free software. They are maintained by people who care about freedom. And the ones that contain non-free programs, they're maintained by people who don't care about freedom. It's that simple. Unfortunately, the well-known distros are non-free. You can get more info about distros in gnu.org/distros. Which ones are free, which ones are not, and why not, and you can see our criteria as well. You're likely to encounter non-free programs and run them as you browse the web. Many web pages contain programs. They're typically written in the JavaScript language, so we refer to them as JavaScript programs. But the point is, the web server sends the program to your browser. It gets installed silently in your browser, and you don't realize that you're running a non-free program. As a protection, we've developed Libre.js. It's an add-on for Firefox that checks for any non-trivial, non-free JavaScript programs and blocks them and warns you. It also scans the site heuristically, looking for where and how to complain to the webmasters, so that you can quickly and easily send your complaint. I couldn't use your site because it wanted me to run a non-free JavaScript program. Please free it. Another way you can lose control of your computing is if you entrust it to somebody else's server. This is a practice known as SaaS, Service as a Software Substitute, which means what it literally what it says. It's a service that's trying to substitute for running a program yourself. You see, when you do your computing activity by running a program yourself and it's your copy, then if that program is free, you have control over what you're doing. The reason a non-free program takes away your freedom is that you don't have control over what it does, even though it's your copy running in your machine. But what if it's not your copy and it's not in your machine? If your computing is done by a program running in somebody else's server, you don't control that. Even if it's free software, you don't control that copy. It's not yours. It's the server owner's copy, and she controls it, but you don't. So if you use SaaS, you lose control of your computing. In addition, you have to send all the pertinent data to the server, which means it's effectively spying on you, and the server operator can change the software, install different programs at any time, which means that it's like a universal backdoor. SaaS, by its structure, is equivalent to running a proprietary program with spy functionality and a universal backdoor. So you've got to reject it. We want freedom, but there are obstacles we have to cross to get there. The companies that subjugate users make lots of money. They use that money to try to stop people from escaping. There was a lot of news when Munich decided to move to the gnu+linux operating system. Well, recently, Microsoft more or less paid Munich to drop it by agreeing to move an office into Munich and thus pay taxes in Munich. Now, if Microsoft had paid money to a politician, an individual, that would have been a crime. But bribing the government itself is not a crime. That's what Microsoft is doing. But if we want politicians to stand up for freedom and democracy, we need politicians who will refuse to let the state be bought in this way. So we've got to protest against those companies when they show up. Another obstacle comes from the term open source. In 1998, as the free software community had developed some momentum and a lot of interest, people in the community who disagreed with our ideas of freedom looked for a way to bury our ideas and get them forgotten. They coined the term open source, which had never been used in our field before, as an alternate way to talk about the same programs, but that would not raise any ethical issues about them. Especially, it would not claim that proprietary software is wrong. That's the idea above all they wanted to bury. They didn't want to present this question as an ethical one, but rather purely as a practical one. They constructed a different discourse based on their term, one that appeals only to practical values. So where we say, if you develop and release a program, you are morally obliged to respect users' freedom to change and redistribute it, they say something very different. If you develop and release a program, it might be in your practical interest to let users change and redistribute it, because then they'll improve the code quality. So what, above all, they refuse to say is that software developers have a moral obligation to respect freedom for the users. To hear them say it, the software developers don't have any moral obligation to anyone but themselves. In practice, they're talking about the same kind of software development and the same programs. But in terms of ethics, they've decided to ignore it. So when people talk about open source, it hampers our spreading the idea that people deserve freedom. But freedom is frequently threatened. To keep it, you have to defend it. To defend it, you have to value it. And to value it, you have to have the concept. People don't automatically get the idea of freedom. We have to spread it to them. And that's what open source tries to prevent. It tries to prevent the idea of freedom from being spread by relabeling our work with their term. They disconnect our work from our ideas. And they've been pretty effective, because the open source supporters were the majority in '98, and they still are. And most of the discussion of our work uses the term open source and thus downplays or completely omits the ethical ideas. People write to me several times a week thanking me for my work on open source. I have to explain to them that they've been misinformed. I'm not a supporter of open source. That's the term of people who disagree with me and reject the idea of freedom I stand for. I've even seen articles that called me the father of open source. So I send a letter saying, a letter to the editor, if I'm the father of open source, it was conceived through artificial insemination using stolen sperm without my knowledge or consent. Then I explain the ethical ideas of the free software movement, which is the purpose of the letter, to show the readers of that publication these ideas, which are important, ideas that were obviously omitted from the article. But I start with a joke, because jokes are good, and maybe they'll publish my article because of it. Anyway, the problem is, since the open source people are the majority, and the businesses especially prefer to say open source, so as to avoid ethical issues. The journalists have mostly adopted that term as well. In mainstream media, you hardly ever see free software. You see open source, and only the ideas of open source too. And you can see it pervasively taken for granted that this is only a practical question. So you can help our cause tremendously if you teach the habit of never saying open source, just as I've done. I never talk about programs by calling them, by distinguishing whether they're open source or not. I distinguish between free programs and proprietary, and I always use those terms. Another obstacle is when we can't run the hardware because the manufacturers refuse to tell us how. And this is quite common. They'll sell you the product, they refuse to tell you how to give it commands. Instead, they say, here's a proprietary program to control the hardware, use it and shut up. But we can't use that. We'd be giving up our freedom. So we need to do reverse engineering to figure out how to control it. Reverse engineering means studying the source code, studying the executable. I misspoke. Because all you've got is the executable. You don't have the source code. That's why it's hard to see what it does. So you have to study the executable and figure out what it does, which is very hard. And then you have to figure out from that the specs of the machine. There's another technique for reverse engineering, which is to look at the data passing between the computer and a peripheral. That way, without looking at the driver, you can figure out what the commands are. It's not easy, but we have to do it. this university should teach reverse engineering. You should demand that. It's very important. It's also a very lucrative profession. There's every reason why the university should teach this skill. Now, government agencies must never use a proprietary program. They do their computing for the people, and they have a responsibility to maintain control over it, which means don't abandon that control to private hands. So don't run a proprietary program. Don't use a private company's SaaS service as a software substitute, because that way the company gets control over the people's computing. That's wrong. It violates the computational sovereignty of the country. And if the agency has any critical functions, it also endangers national security. Remember all the universal backdoors and ask yourself who might be able to use them to sabotage that agency. Now, schools are even more important. They've got to switch to free software. Schools must teach free software, only free software, and they must explain why. Why, as a matter of principle, they're not going to teach a proprietary program, because that is spreading dependence. It's wrong. Teaching people to use proprietary softwares like teaching kids to use proprietary softwares like teaching them to smoke tobacco. It's a way of making them dependent. Think of that when proprietary developers say that there's a discount for schools. Tobacco companies used to offer a discount for children, too. In addition, the school has to teach the spirit of goodwill, the habit of cooperating with others. So every class must have this rule. Students, if you bring software to class, you may not keep it for yourself. You must share it with the rest of the class, including the source code, because this is a place where we share our knowledge. Therefore, it's not permitted to bring proprietary software to this class. But there's also the spirit of education. You see, some kids want to learn about software, and then when they look at a non-free program, all they see is the ones and zeros. The knowledge in the program is hidden, denied to the students. A non-free program is the enemy of the spirit of education. The school must not tolerate non-free software except for reverse engineering. But when the software is free, students can study it and learn about how to write code, and they can see what code is clear and what's not clear. It's simple. When you try to understand the code, if you could easily understand it, it's clear, and whatever points are hard to understand, they're badly written. This is how you learn to recognize what's good and bad in code, and how you learn to write good, clear code. You have to read lots of code and write lots of code. If you want to learn to understand big programs, you've got to read the code of big programs and then write changes, initially small changes, in existing large programs. Only free software gives the opportunity to do that. Only if the school is a free software school can it teach these things, the craft of programming. Human rights depend on each other. Thus, if you lose one human right, it's hard to defend the other human rights. Now that we use computers for so much, free software is one of the human rights that the other human rights depend on. We must insist that software be free. And sometimes that means making a sacrifice. It means accepting an inconvenience. It means recognizing you can't do this through your computer, not today, because there is no free program to do it, so you got to do it some other way. Or maybe the free program for a certain thing doesn't do everything or it's not as convenient. The question is, do you care about freedom enough to make a sacrifice to keep it? Those who don't value their freedom will lose it. So how can you help us? See gnu.org/help for the full list. But if you're a programmer and you can write good, useful, big programs, that's a good way. Also, if you're good at writing users' manuals, that's a good way. Write free manuals for the free programs. You can organize groups to campaign to move to free software and criticize proprietary software. You can persuade schools and governments to migrate to free software. This school ought to get rid of all the proprietary software, just as every school should. It'll take years to do so, but they should at least start on it. You know, they should start taking big enough steps that in a few years they will move to free software. And you can participate in gnu/linux user groups. That they do a useful job. But please don't call them Linux user groups. They would do the same job, but it's important to tell people where the system comes from and why it exists. You see, the name GNU is associated with our campaign for freedom, which is why we developed the system. The GNU system is what it is. It turns out that Mr. Torvalds is an open source person. He never agreed with our ideas of freedom. Well, he has a right to his views. But when people erroneously call the GNU system Linux, and you'll see that that's happening constantly, it gives people the wrong idea. Then they think it was all started by Torvalds in 1991, which is not true, and they'll think that the system comes from his views, which couldn't have been true, because the open source views don't give people a reason to do what we did, which is work on replacing every part of the system to have something that's totally free software. It's only if you value freedom that you see a reason why that is necessary. Our views were the necessary reason to do our work. And when people are told that the system is Linux, it misleads them about the origin of our system, and it discourages them from caring about freedom today. And also say free software rather than open source. If you want to, you can learn to be a speaker and give talks like this. Very useful thing to do. So now I've run out of slides. I only have them for the topic of free software. Proprietary software threatens users' freedom. It denies users control of what their own computers are doing. But there are other threats to our freedom in the digital society. By the way, for more information about licenses, look at gnu.org/licenses. We have a long list of licenses saying which ones are free, which ones are not. For the free ones, it states what their advantages and disadvantages are. We have gnu.org/philosophy, which has many articles about specific political or philosophical questions about freedom. And we also have gnu.org/help. But once you start using computers in other ways, other freedoms can be threatened. For instance, nowadays, digital technology is used for surveillance, and not just on the internet. It turns out that digital technology lends itself to keeping track of what everyone does, and this is a threat to democracy. Sometimes the data is collected by companies. Sometimes it's collected directly by the state. The difference doesn't really change very much, because when the companies collect the data, there are typically laws to make it easy for the state to get or look at that data. So one way or another, the state is tracking people, and that's what's so dangerous. because the state uses this information to find journalists' sources and imprison them so as to intimidate them and put an end to real journalism. Democracy means that the people control what the state does. But if we don't know what the state does, we can't control it. So how do we find out the things that often vicious things that the state is secretly doing? With the help of whistleblowers, heroes like Edward Snowden. 3 cheers for Edward Snowden. Hip, hip, hooray! Hip, hip, hooray! Hip, hip, hooray! It's very important to be this explicit in our praise for Snowden, because there are so many politicians that are supporting the secrecy and the spies and the persecution of these heroes. We have to be completely clear about our full support for their heroic informing the public of what the public needs to know. But if the government can always tell where everybody goes and who talks with whom, it's impossible to safely be a whistleblower. We see governments like the US and the UK trying to prohibit encryption that they can't break. Without encryption, you can't have a WikiLeaks. So it's basically they'd be hammering shut the coffin of democracy. Sometimes they spy on people through their own computers, often with non-free software that very often spies on the user. In that case, you can block their spying by insisting on free software. But they also track people and snoop on people through systems that don't belong to us, but that we need to use. For instance, internet service providers and phone companies. We can't prevent them from recording what sites we talk with or who we make phone calls to. Not individually, not through our own technology. The only way we can stop that is by politically organizing. And sometimes they set up systems whose only purpose is to track people. In the UK, they've put cameras by the roads to track the cars by their license plates. And they have so many cameras that they track all car travel. They can find any car in real time, and they make a dossier about each car. They can keep that dossier for years if they want to. It doesn't take so much space that it would be difficult. And they've already used that system to sabotage protest. Protesters, or suspected protesters, were arrested on the way to a protest. And they were held there until the protest was over. And then they were allowed to go. Clearly, they were not suspected of a crime. Rather, this was a preemptive attack against democracy. Maybe they would have done some gruesome thing like climbing a building and dropping a banner. A crime that the plutocratic UK government believed necessary to thwart at any price to democracy. Not that they care about democracy. So, the danger to democracy is not just possible, it's clearly real. So, we've got to organize to stop surveillance, and we need, above all, to have the courage not to bow down to demands for surveillance every time somebody commits a shocking crime, or every time the officials say that somebody might commit a shocking crime or claim that they prevented some. In the U.S., they keep saying that they prevented some shocking crimes by spying on everybody, and what it turns out to really have been is that some of their operatives made contact with some people who are somewhat deranged and tend to have violent fantasies, and gets those people to say, yes, I'd like to put a bomb somewhere, and then they arrest the people, and these people could never have done anything if they hadn't been led to go along with that. They have no knowledge or contacts or any way to actually hurt anyone, but it's sufficient to imprison them for life and then say, see, we're protecting you. We're keeping the elephants away by spying on you all the time. I don't know if you heard the joke about the man who was doing some bizarre thing and said he was keeping the elephants away, and others said, but there are no elephants here. And he said, see, it works. Another threat to our freedom in the digital society is, well, actually, I should point out to you that I've identified the upper limit on surveillance that is compatible with democracy. Surveillance has to be less than what would enable the government to find whistleblowers and dissidents. If the government tracks everybody enough that it can tell who's a dissident, we're all cooked. Look at gnu.org/philosophy/surveillance vs democracy.html. Another threat to our freedom is censorship. Censorship is not new, but 20 years ago, we naively thought that the internet would put an end to censorship. It would be too hard for governments to censor the internet. Well, now we know that they can censor the internet. They just have to put enough effort in and not mind making some fraction of the populace angry. And it's not just the obvious dictatorships like China and Iran that censor the internet. Oh, no. Sad to say, because of course governments like that are not going to respect human rights. Unfortunately, the so-called free countries don't respect them either. In 2006, I believe, Finland imposed filters on internet access. ISPs were told to block access to certain sites. Somebody figured he would find out which sites were blocked and publish a report. The government wouldn't tell him, so he just made a list of possibly blocked sites and tried to access them and saw which ones were blocked. And then he published the list. So they blocked access to his site. He sued, and the Finnish Supreme Court a year or so ago ruled that it was legal to block access to his site. Although his site didn't have any pornography, and supposedly the censorship was to block pornography, still it was okay to block access to his site. From Finland only. You could still access it from here. It's not very interesting because he hasn't updated it since then. So it will tell you about, it's interesting for historical comparison, I suppose, if you're studying the evolution of government censorship in Finland. You could make your own list for today and compare with that list then. But you could get at it. It's only the victims of Finnish government censorship that can't read about Finnish government censorship. But many countries have gone much further than that. Several years ago, one of the first things that President Erdogan in Turkey did to attack human rights was to impose on every Turkish internet user a choice between censorship and more censorship and yet more censorship and even more censorship. 4 levels of censorship, but there was no option of access to the real internet. Turks protested in the street, which is showing a high degree of concern for human rights. So bravo to the Turkish protesters, but Erdogan didn't care about that. So the censorship continues. There is some hope that the newly successful opposition party will be able to do something about this. Maybe. And recently, the UK imposed something similar. You now, as an internet user in the UK, have a choice between 2 levels of censorship. There's censorship for adults and even more censorship for kids. And the default is for kids. If you can afford your own internet connection, you can choose to have less censorship. But if you're dependent on public access sites, networks, you're stuck with the censorship for kids. So it's even more censorship on poor people. Of course, this is tyranny. There are other kinds of censorship. In Australia, there's censorship of links. There are links that are forbidden. And Electronic Frontier Australia was ordered to delete a link to a foreign political website on pain of a fine of $11,000 a day. And what was this site about? Was it a site that advocated terrorism? No, it was just about as nasty. It was an anti-abortion rights website. The sort of thing that spreads poverty and kills women. But they have a right to present their views, even to Australians. You see, respect for freedom of speech means respecting the right to say the things we disagree with. I respect people's right to oppose abortion. I respect people's right to advocate open source. I respect people's right even to promote proprietary programs, because that's freedom of speech for you. Now, you may never have experienced freedom of speech because in most countries it doesn't really exist. Many countries will put people in prison for merely insulting someone. When I found out about this, I was shocked. Because you don't have freedom of speech if you're not allowed to insult the president or a police thug or whatever else. If there's anyone it's a crime to insult, that's not freedom of speech. And the argument they give for this criminalization is really loony. They say, if you say some insulting words, it could hurt someone horribly. You might think that somebody who is a politician should by now have learned to be able to live through that. But what, after all, are the most hurtful words anyone can say? I'm leaving you. But if we recognize and respect the right to say, I'm leaving you, it's silly to prohibit any other words that might hurt less. It's like locking the window while the door's open. It's pointless. And there are other kinds of censorship, too. In India, anything that's considered to offend someone's religion, any religion, can be taken off the internet arbitrarily. In most of these countries, censorship goes on without even a trial. So freedom of speech is in terrible danger around the world. We've got to campaign for it. We've got to recognize that people must be free to express any opinions. Would you like to give me some more tea? Thanks. The next threat to our freedom, well, there are several threats that come from internet servers, the use of them by visitors, by clients. One is that they send non-free JavaScript programs. I already explained about that. Another is that they collect lots of data about people, and they're very likely to misuse that data sooner or later. If you just visit the home page of a site, especially if it's a commercial site or has any advertising, it almost certainly tells many companies that you visited the site. Facebook is a good example of this. Of course, you know Facebook does surveillance of its useds. I don't say its users because it's using them. So I call them useds of Facebook. So, but actually Facebook does surveillance on most internet users through the like buttons. You might not realize that when you see a like button, it means Facebook is tracking you. Facebook knows that your computer visited that page. Because in order to display the like button, it had to ask a Facebook server to send the image to display, and probably some JavaScript code as well. And part of the HTTP protocol is it tells the server which page this is for. So the Facebook server knows your machine's IP, and it knows which page you're visiting. And it probably associates that IP address with you. Facebook disguises the truth about what it's doing by saying things that are not exactly lies but do mislead. For instance, Facebook says when it sells a user's profile, it doesn't say who the user is. I suppose it's telling the truth, but it sells it to another company that figures out who the user is and then sells that to somebody else. So in practice, it's not doing you any good at all. It's just pretending to track you less. Now, you can block these like buttons and many other similar things if you use the GNU web browser IceCat, obviously a modified version of Firefox. One of the priorities for IceCat is protecting users' privacy. But in addition to the surveillance that these sites do, they also ask users overtly for lots of personal data, which they then have, and they'll probably show it to Big Brother when asked and sell it to lots of other companies. So I refuse to use those sites. I just won't. I once made an exception. I needed to send a lot of money when it was the right time to somebody, so I had to tell my bank remotely to do the transfer I had already told them about. I did this from a computer I borrowed from someone that I was never going to use again. I think of it as a burner computer. Of course, we didn't throw it away. I just It was theirs before and it was theirs after, but I'm never going to be there again. The point is, I don't want any of those sites to get data about me, and because of that, I generally won't give my name or any personal data to these sites. There's one other exception. I post comments in discussions, and for those, I do give my name. I defend the right to post anonymous comments. It's very important, but I am in a safe position, so I can give my name. But I don't connect directly to those sites. So you've got to be very careful of what data you provide to any service. But nowadays, lots of services are inviting people to keep all their data on the service. Well, that's, again, it's computing for suckers. And they use a term to cloud users' minds. They call this cloud computing. They call lots of things cloud computing. The worst part about the term, quote, cloud computing, unquote, is that it's used to refer to lots of different scenarios which raise different issues and treat them all as one thing. You can't think clearly. But I did see a wonderful sticker from FSF Europe that explains this. It says, "There is no cloud, only other people's computers." So if somebody says, "Let's do this using the cloud," the response is, "Oh, you're planning to do this with other people's computers." Whose computers? Which computer is going to do what, and what country is it in? And if they can't get the answers to those, they can't trust it. Well, people mostly know nowadays about that you can't trust these companies with all the data they're getting. But there's another problem that they don't know about, which is the problem of SaaS. I explained that earlier. The point is, this is different from the problem that they have personal data about you. Because they could have the personal data even though they're not doing your computing. That problem we understand. SaaS is a different problem, that if you entrust your computing activity to the server operator controls how your computing is done, which is separate from having your data. They're both bad. So there are two problems with that server. A, it has your data, and B, it controls how your computing activity is done. But there are ethical ways of using internet services for some purposes. For instance, renting a remote server where you can install the programs you wish is not SaaS. That virtual server, virtual or real, it's either way, it doesn't matter much, it's running the software you chose. So you do control the computing it does for you. That's not SaaS. So you see, these different scenarios for making use of other people's computers raise different issues. We have to look at how you're using them and who has control over what. A rented remote virtual server is not a safe place to keep your personal data, but it might be a fine way to operate some service of yours which isn't doing anything sensitive and isn't tracking people. One of the causes of surveillance on the internet is the practice of funding websites through advertising. But they say, how else can they raise money? We are trying to give them a new way with the project gnu+linux, which is a a system of anonymous digital cash, which has two crucial differences from Bitcoin. First of all, Bitcoin's not anonymous, and this really is mathematically anonymous. They can't tell who made the payments. And second, the site that gets the payments can't spend the digital cash again. All it can do is take those payments to a bank and convert them into money. So gnu+ can't be used for tax evasion. And I hope someday that websites will be able to get their funds by accepting payment to use their services anonymously. I wouldn't mind buying a download if I could pay for it anonymously. In fact, I did once pay for some ethically sold ebooks. They had no DRM. I didn't have to sign any or agree to any contract. That is, no end-user license agreement, and I paid anonymously cash. That's the only ethical way to sell copies of ebooks. But it's hard to do that today with a website because there's no way to pay the site anonymously. But once we've set one up, they'll be able to start. Don't accept distribution of digital media that give you less freedom than you would get with physical media. And don't buy anything from Amazon. Look at stallman.org/Amazon for a long list of reasons. Another example of a disservice is Goober. Now, Goobers means peanuts, and that company pays the drivers peanuts. So instead of calling it Uber, I think we should call it Goober. But the nastiest thing about it is, to be a client, you have to run a non-free program which identifies who you are. And this, compared with ordinary taxis, makes it an attack on our freedom. We must not permit Goober to replace taxis. We shouldn't allow Goober to operate until it has a mode of anonymous use. So here we see another system that collects digital dossiers about people. Of course, nobody's forced to use Goober. But if there are no taxis anymore, in practice, you're strongly pressured to use Goober when, say, some years before, you would have hailed a taxi. So it's not quite right to say that people use Goober only if they wish to. When something becomes incorporated enough into society that it's a hassle to refuse it, then they can no longer benefit from the argument that you don't have to use this. They've got to be treated like things that you do sort of have to use, and regulated like things you do sort of have to use. Another threat to our freedom comes from the use of computers for voting. You can't trust computers for elections. They make it too easy to rig the election. They facilitate centralized fraud. Now, election fraud has existed before. paper ballots don't guarantee there is no fraud. But the bigger the fraud is, the easier it is to spot. It's harder and harder to hide it as it gets bigger. But inside a computer, it's just as easy to add 1,000 votes as it is to add 1 vote. You can add 1,024 votes. It's the same operation as adding 1 vote. It's just a different bit. So if a voting machine gives only totals at the end, that means it's an election that cannot be audited. You must not allow that to be done. Politicians love this. They have this absurd idea, but they want to even go beyond computers that count votes that can't be audited. They want to have internet voting, which is basically nuts. Imagine doing internet voting from a machine that's part of a botnet. The botnet will decide how you vote. It'll show you that you're voting for A while sending a vote for B. Estonia famously uses internet voting. A team of investigators studied their system and found horrible flaws and pointed out that this goes beyond just the danger that some party might decide to win the election by fiddling with the computers. Russia could decide who's going to win the Estonian election by fiddling with the computers. His point is, in order to trust internet voting, you'd have to make a system that was secure even against powerful state attackers. And they haven't done that. They would fall over right away. Now, with paper ballots, in the U.S., it's customary to have political parties send poll watchers, and their job is simply to look for anything that seems wrong, irregular, possible fraud. Well, with paper ballots, anybody of normal intelligence can understand what it's supposed to do, how it's supposed to look, how to recognize possible fraud. You can volunteer to be a poll watcher, be trained, and go do it. But when the voting is inside a computer, only an expert can tell whether the computer is honest. And the expert can't check it while the voting is going on. The expert has to check before. But how do you know the program that's running during the voting is the same one that the expert checked? You can't tell. Voting is special because you can't verify that your vote was counted properly. Compare this with e-commerce. With e-commerce, to some extent, you're trusting the store not to cheat you, but at least you can tell if the store cheats you, and you can complain, and at that point you can then get justice. But if the election authority cheats you by counting your vote wrong, you won't even find out. This is why free software is not a solution here. If the voting machine has proprietary software in it, that is controlled by the company that made it, which therefore can use it to rig the election. But suppose it has free software in it, then that copy belongs to the electoral authority. So the electoral authority can use it to rig the election. Well, you can't trust either one of them. And the point is, you can't monitor them either. We've got to vote on paper. The risks of using computers for voting are too great. It's not worth it to save a little money by taking that risk. Oh, and Oh, and what about voter-verified paper ballots? Well, there are voting machines where the voter enters votes and it spits out a paper ballot, and the voter gets a chance to look at it and verify it's correct, and then it goes into the urn. In principle, that should work, but somebody did an experiment and found that almost everybody didn't bother to check. You see, in the experiment, they intentionally made the paper ballots disagree with what the subject had entered. They didn't notice. Well, if they don't really check, it's not going to help. And sometimes people have reported that computerized voting machines keep on insisting on changing the vote back to so-and-so. And they keep saying no, and it changes it anyway. You can't trust this. The next threat to to our freedom in the digital society comes from the war on sharing, the persistent campaign to attack people who share copies of digital publications. Now, this is wrong. The war on sharing is wrong because sharing is good. Sharing is cooperation with other people in society, and it ought to be legal. But publishers don't want us to be able to get the benefits of digital technology. They have been fighting for decades to deny us those benefits. They want to impose a pay-per-view world on us. They started with propaganda, calling the people who share pirates, which is basically saying that helping your neighbor is the moral equivalent of attacking ships. But that's wrong. Attacking ships is very bad and sharing is good. So let's not call them both by the same name. We shouldn't repeat the enemy's propaganda. We should refuse to use the word pirates to mean people that share. So when people ask me what I think of piracy, I say attacking ships is very bad. Let's send the Navy. When they ask me what I think of movie piracy, I say, I like the first Pirates of the Caribbean. That's movie piracy for you. But if they had stopped with propaganda, I wouldn't call it a war. After all, they have the right to present their views. But they didn't stop there. They began perverting our technology by putting in DRM, digital handcuffs, malicious functionalities designed to stop us from doing what we wish with the data in our computers. And sad to say, they're basically winning that fight. At the technical level, they're winning. The recent DRM schemes, we have not been able to break. Nobody has been able to make free software that can read any Blu-ray disc, and nobody has been able to make free software that can play a Netflix video or listen to an encrypted Spotify stream. Those are DRM systems people have not broken. We've got to reject them completely. I won't even listen to a song through Spotify through somebody else's computer. I wanted to hear a song, somebody came up with his phone saying, here it is. I said, do you have a copy or are you using Spotify? He said it was Spotify, and I said, thank you, but I'm not going to listen. We have to treat those streaming disservices as poison, because they are poison for our freedom. We must not treat them as acceptable. Out, damned Spotify. So, we've seen these malicious functionalities with video, with music, and with books. And in a terribly sad event about a year ago, Mozilla decided to include the Adobe DRM in Firefox. No, it's not exactly included. They sort of made it slightly indirect. Firefox contains something to download and install the DRM. Doesn't change anything ethically. It's a minor technical distinction. Of course, IceCat does not have that. IceCat won't even offer you the chance to install that DRM. Of course, since it's free software, you could modify it to do so. You should be free to make any modification you wish, but we are never going to lead people in the direction of giving up their freedom. However, we need to fight to prevent society from going in that direction. And one way is never accept copies or looking at works with DRM. It's no good. But they didn't stop with introducing DRM. Then they passed laws to make it a crime to break DRM or tell people how to break DRM. And with those laws, governments explicitly took the side of those businesses against the people. This is what showed us what the European Union had become. In like 2001 or so, you could see with the EU copyright directive that the European Union had fallen into the hands of businesses and had become a means to sabotage democracy in Europe. The European Union was at one point a beautiful idea. If it had not fallen into the hands of the businesses, it might still be one. But the European Union, as it exists, is allowing businesses to get power in one area after another. It has to be made democratic or abolished. I'm sorry to say this, but the European Union, as it exists, is harmful. It's incompatible with democracy. It is a means for businesses to subjugate people. The European Parliament recently voted in favor of negotiating this treaty is plutocratic, the TTIP. This treaty is plutocratic, is what it means. It's a corporate supremacy treaty pretending to be a trade agreement. But its real purpose is to give businesses more power, especially foreign businesses. They will be superior to legislatures, superior to laws. Essentially, it's an extraterritorial power that amounts to colonization. Those corporate supremacy treaties must be destroyed. Starting with the one that set up the World Trade Organization. That treaty is being used to prevent governments from discouraging smoking. Now, they're not banning tobacco. That would be a really stupid thing, and they're not doing it. What they want to do is require cigarettes and tobacco generally to be sold in plain packages that make them less attractive to victims. And the companies have the gall to claim that that it's their right to use their attractive artwork on these packages. And they're using these so-called trade treaties as mass murder treaties. Those treaties must be torn up. Of course, you can also see mass murder in the way the World Trade Organization has been used to harass the production and distribution of generic medicines that are cheap enough to save the life of people, of poor people around the world. So everyone in charge of running the World Trade Organization and the people who set it up, they should be sent to The Hague for trial for mass murder. And in the response to the Greek referendum, we also see which politicians are on the side of the banks for economic warfare and occupation of countries that fall into the gears of the euro. There's no way that they can deny now that they stand for suffering for the sake of the banks. But getting back to the war on sharing, they didn't stop there. The next idea was to start suing teenagers for hundreds of thousands of dollars for sharing. They did that, but it won them a lot of hatred. So the bigger companies desisted. But then they got an idea of trying to punish the peer-to-peer network users by abolishing the basic principle of justice: no punishment without a fair trial. They want to punish people by disconnection from the internet without having to prove, supposedly for sharing, but without proving they actually shared anything. The mere accusation is supposed to be enough. And they have established laws like this in the UK, in New Zealand, in South Korea. They got one in Colombia, but the Supreme Court said it was unconstitutional, so they're going to try again with a slightly different one. And this shows that they have no respect for any idea of human rights. In the United States, it would be clearly unconstitutional to do this. So Obama figured out a way around it. Obama is on the side of those companies against the people. Obama, although he's a Democrat, is actually a center-right politician. I didn't vote for him because I saw he was right-wing. He worked out a deal between the major ISPs and the copyright industry by which the ISPs agree to punish their own customers when they're accused of sharing, and also rat on them to the copyright industry companies that might sue them. And they were able to do this because as an internet user in the US, you don't have any rights. These companies are allowed to arbitrarily punish their customers. And the US recently got a standard of network neutrality, which is pretty good but not perfect, because it permits, of course, the government decided to permit the ISPs to punish their own customers for apparently sharing. One thing that we must do to defeat the war on sharing is refuse to be conscripted into it. Governments want to conscript us all into their enforcers. In other words, using collective responsibility, where you are ordered to control others. And if you don't control others, you'll be punished. So the way to resist this is by maintaining Wi-Fi networks without a key, so that people passing by can connect to the internet. If all your traffic is encrypted, then it doesn't affect your security at all. So it is a moral duty to leave Wi-Fi networks unencrypted, even in countries like Germany, where the state may punish this. The punishment is not so much. It won't ruin your life, and it's not likely to happen anyway. So don't be a coward. Refuse to be conscripted into the war on sharing. And the next step is set up a fund which raises money from the public to pay the fine of anyone who is convicted of refusing to be conscripted into the war on sharing. But it gets even worse. In Japan, it is now a crime punished by 2 years imprisonment to download an unauthorized copy of any work from the internet. And if that's not enough, I suppose they'll start executing people for sharing, because those companies will go to any lengths to get what they want, which is to deny us the benefit of the internet for cooperating with each other. We need to put an end to the war on sharing. We need to legalize sharing, pure and simple. It's no accident that they use a series of increasingly cruel and draconian measures, because what they're trying to do is wrong and antisocial, and everyone can see it. Sharing is good, and with digital technology, sharing is easy unless they have perverted it and attacked us. So only cruel and draconian measures can make people stop sharing, and each time one of them fails, they go to another that's worse. So we've got to reject the end, not just the means. We have to explicitly legalize sharing and tell those companies, go jump in the lake. We don't care if you make less money than you thought you would. You're not important anyway. We need to make some other changes in copyright law. In addition to legalizing sharing, we have to make sure that the right to share can't be taken away through other measures. So implementing DRM should be a crime. Imposing end-user license agreements on copies of published works should be a crime. Or more precisely, perhaps they should simply lack all legal value. They should be impossible to enforce. No matter which country you so supposedly agreed to this contract in, it should be impossible to enforce here. In addition, copyright shouldn't last so long. It shouldn't last a century or more. I suggest that copyright expire after 10 years from the date of publication. Meanwhile, we have to legalize remix. Now, here's a piece of sad and ironic news. You may have heard of Jorge Luis Borges, whose short stories were, you might say, conceptual hacks. He wrote a story about somebody who decided to write Don Quixote, the famous novel, again. And he wrote it with the same words, but he didn't just copy them. No, he had to write the same words again at that time. But of course, the meaning of those words in the 1930s was totally different from what those words meant in the 16th century, because they were being read by by people with different ideas. So to write those same words was an act of artistic creation, or at least so claimed this story. Whether Borges really agreed with that or not, he thought the idea was interesting. So somebody decided to remix a Borges story. Not the same one. I think he should have used that one, but he took a different one and added an equal amount of writing of his own and published this as a remix. And Borges's heir is prosecuting him, trying to get him imprisoned for this, not just suing him. The fact that you could even get someone imprisoned for this shows that copyright law has gone off the deep end. I think Borges would have been amused by this publication. But his heir, of course, is not the sort of genius that Borges was. So, we need to legalize remix, which basically means taking pieces of various things and putting them together into a work that is totally different in its purpose and overall nature. This is making new works. That's what copyright is supposed to exist to encourage. The purpose of copyright is to encourage making new works. Now, I believe that functional works ought to be free. Software, recipes for cooking, educational works, reference works, typefaces for displaying paragraphs of text, hardware designs, object models for printing functional objects, that is, not merely decorative. They should be free. I don't advocate at this point legislating that they all must be free. That change seems too radical to insist on this way. I hope that we will someday reach a society where people are ready for this and proprietary software will basically cease to exist. I don't propose to legislate this right away. Society has to be ready to accept it. Laws society is not ready to accept cause big misery. In any case, though, that's my goal. However, the copyright industry, the publishers, would say, this is horrible, then you wouldn't pay the artists. Well, the fact is, all the artists get today is a little trickle down. With the exception of a few stars. They're very nice to the stars. Stars may even get rich. There are not so many stars. Even being an author on the New York Times bestseller list doesn't mean you get rich. To get rich, you have to be way beyond that. There are not very many stars. And the rest of the artists, they get trickle down. Well, the publishers try to get us to accept a foolish requirement. They say we need to, quote, compensate the rights holders, unquote. That's trying to fool you in two different ways. First of all, they don't say the artists, they say the rights holders. That means the publishers, mostly. And the artists a little bit once in a while. I don't agree that we owe the rights holders money. I think we should support artists. But when they say compensate, that's another trick, another pitfall. There is a time when you have an obligation to compensate an artist. If you hire an artist to do a job for you and the artist does it, then you owe the artist the pay that was agreed on. That's compensating an artist for work done. That's the only time you owe the artist compensation. But if you appreciate the artist's work, that doesn't mean you owe the artist money. But you might want to support the artist because it's a good idea. If you appreciate art, you should help support artists. That's not a debt. You don't owe a composer money because you heard a composition and liked it. You don't owe an author money because you read a book and liked it. But you might want to give them money to help them keep working. Now, I think it's perfectly fine for them to sell copies. I wish the artists got more of that money and publishers less. I think it's fine to charge money for admission to a performance. Sad to say, the publishers are worming their way into that too. But I propose additional ways we can support artists more, better than the existing system, and these ways are compatible with legalizing sharing. Now, one way is the government can put up a certain amount of money to be divided among the artists in order to support them. It could get this money by a special tax on internet connection or just take it out of the general budget. It doesn't matter how they get the money. The point is it'll support artists better with less money, and here's how. We distribute the money among the artists by measuring the popularity of each one. I'm just being conservative. The existing system supports artists based on their popularity, so let's stick with that. How do you measure it? If everybody's free to share, you can't count the copies sold, but you can count how often various works are shared on the internet. You can do various kinds of polling and sampling. It should be anonymous, of course. And you can get a popularity figure for each artist. How do you distribute the money? The obvious way is linear proportion. So if A is twice as popular as B, A would get twice as much money as B. If A is a star and is 1,000 times as popular as non-star B, then A would get 1,000 times as much money as B. And this shows why linear proportion is a bad way, because most of the money would go to a few stars, and the artists who are rich anyway, and the artists that really need help, the fairly popular, fairly good artists, they would get so little it wouldn't make a difference for them. If we want this to support artists better, we have to transfer most of the money from the stars to the mid-range popularity artists. We can do that by taking the cube root of each artist's popularity figure. Cube root looks sort of like this. It keeps growing. It never goes down, but it goes up slower. The cube root of 1,000 is 10. So if A is 1,000 times as popular as B, and we take the cube root, A will get 10 times as much as B. Not 1,000 times, just 10. Which means the cube root transfers money from the stars to the mid-range popularity artists where it will really make a difference for their ability to do art and be as good as they can be at it. So this system, because it wouldn't direct most of the money to the stars as the current system does, and because it would only give the money to the artists, would be a lot more efficient. We'd support the arts better with less money. I have another idea. Give every player a button to send some money to the artists anonymously, perhaps using gnu+linux. And you can send the money or not. Nothing will punish you if you don't, but if you send money, you'll feel good. How much money is best? The amount that maximizes what people choose to send. I'm not an economist. I could only guess what it should be. I think in Germany, maybe €0.50. In the U.S., maybe 10 cents. The U.S. is poorer nowadays than it used to be due to right-wing austerity. And so in each country, they could fix the amount of payment to try to maximize what gets sent. Voluntary payments are already supporting arts. That's what crowdfunding is. And there are many artists that say, send me money if you like, in their websites. Of course, they're asking for much larger amounts of money. If we permit smaller payments, more people can join in, but not everyone. Poor people won't give, and that's fine. We don't need to make poor people support artists. It's good if only the rich people do. Well, actually, I misspoke. It's good if only the non-poor do, because they're not all rich. I think most of you could afford to give €0.50 every day. You're not rich, most of you, but most of you are not poor. So you could afford to give. A few years ago, several prominent science fiction writers released the humble ebook bundle. They said, download it and pay if you wish. They got $1 million in a month, which I read was equivalent to being on the New York Times bestseller list. So it shows voluntary payments can support artists. And the easier we make them, the better they'll support artists. The last thread I want to cover is the fact that internet users have no rights. When you use services in the virtual world, you don't have a right to use them. You use them on sufferance. And that means whatever you do in the virtual world, you can only do it as long as companies are willing to let you keep doing it. If you have some point of view to present, you can write it on a sign and walk around on the street. Not in Spain, where protests are now illegal. Spain has essentially been turned into a police state by the right-wing government, which basically must be overthrown to turn Spain into a democracy again. But here, I suppose, you still have the right to walk around with a sign. And you don't need a company's permission to do it. When you're leaving, please come down and take stickers and buy GNU merchandise before you go. But in the virtual world, to present that, you need the cooperation of a hosting service, a domain name registrar, and an ISP. And they can arbitrarily cut you off because they choose their own terms of service, they interpret these, and they decide whether the terms have been violated. So basically, they're just an excuse to kick off whoever they want to kick off. That's not freedom. We must establish the right to use the essential services, the services that people generally use on the internet, so that you have rights in the virtual world just as you have them in the physical world. I don't know how it is here, but in the US, if you rent an apartment, you sign a contract, but the landlord can't decide arbitrarily what to put in that contract. There are laws that say which conditions are allowed and any other conditions are not. And if the landlord wants to kick you out, he can't just do it. He has to go to court and present proof that there are grounds to kick you out. So if you didn't pay the rent, the landlord can kick you out. Unless you had grounds not to pay the rent, like if the landlord didn't do some of the things the landlords are required by law to do, like provide heat in the winter, then you're allowed to withhold the rent until the landlord fixes things. So all these things will be discussed in the court. This is what it means to have rights in the use of a service. There have to be laws saying what conditions the services can place, whether they're allowed to disconnect someone, and they should have to go to court to prove it. I saw how important this was when the US government tried to hound WikiLeaks off the network. Not by prosecution. Apparently, WikiLeaks hadn't done anything that was a crime in the US. So officials tried to intimidate the services that WikiLeaks depended on to get it excluded from the net. First, Amazon. WikiLeaks had rented an Amazon virtual server. After an intimidating phone call, Amazon reinterpreted its terms of service to say that it wasn't legal to use an Amazon virtual server to publish anything that had been leaked. In other words, in general, journalism couldn't use Amazon virtual servers. That shouldn't be allowed. Then they went after the domain name registrars and then the payment companies. They got PayPal and Google and Visa and MasterCard and Bank of America and more to refuse to pay money to WikiLeaks. So a company in Iceland courageously started accepting payments by credit card for its own, on behalf of WikiLeaks, as well as from its own customers. So Visa and MasterCard cut that company off. At this point, the company sued because under European Union law that was passed back before the European Union had become a mere instrument of business. It passed some laws that actually were good for people regulating business. Because Visa and MasterCard have a substantial fraction of the market, they're not allowed to arbitrarily cut anyone off. The company won the case. They were required to start processing payments to that company again. So this is a sign of what's needed. ISPs should not be allowed to consider anything about the nature of what the customer is sending or receiving. If the customer is sending or receiving things that are somehow a crime, prosecute the customer. But the ISP must not be used as a weapon against anyone. So now it's time for the auction. This is an adorable GNU that needs a home. So I'm going to auction it for the benefit of the Free Software Foundation. If you buy it, I can sign the card. If you have a penguin at home, you need a GNU for your penguin. There should never be a penguin without a GNU. And we can accept payment with cash or with a bank card if it can make international purchases by phone, or with Bitcoin if you have something here to make the payment for. I will be around for like 15 minutes answering questions, so you'll have a chance to go out to a nearby bank machine and come back. When you bid, please wave your arm and shout the amount immediately. Don't wait till I look at you to shout. That's backwards. You've got to shout so I'll see you. And say it loud because I have hearing problems. And I'm going to start with the regular price, 25 euros. Do I get 25 euros for this adorable GNU? How much? Oh, it's not obvious. 25 is the minimum. You can always bid more than the minimum. So I've got 25. Do I get 30? I've got 25. Do I get 30? Who said 40? I've got 40. Do I get 45? I've got 40. Do I get 45 for this adorable GNU? How much? I've got 50. Do I get 55? How much? Are you bidding? Are you bidding? What? I've got 70. Do I get 75? I've got 70. Do I get 75 for this adorable GNU? 75 to the Free Software Foundation to defend freedom. Do I get 75 or more? Last chance to bid 75 or more. Last chance. 75 or more. Going. I've got 100. I've got 100. Do I get 110? 110 for this adorable GNU. 110. We can make it an Eskimo GNU. 110. How much? I've got 120. Do I get 130? 130 or more for this adorable GNU. 130 or more to the Free Software Foundation. Last chance to bid 130 or more. Last chance. Going. Gone for 120. Please come down and pay. Please come.